Welcome back to All Out Physiology. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button if any of this content interests you. Today we're actually going to talk about All Out Physiology and specifically how we went about developing the 3-minute All Out test to determine critical power. Now, to do that I first have to explain to you roughly what critical power is. And that story starts back in the mid-1920s with A.V. Hill. And what he did was plot the relationship between running speed, swimming speed or rowing speed in the world records of the day and the duration of the events. And so he plotted men running, women running, men swimming, women swimming, and also men 8-man rowing. And what he showed was that the relationship between speed and duration followed the same characteristic pattern irrespective of exercise modality and sex. So women and men behaved in the same way, although the curves were positioned differently because men could swim and run faster than women. What we've also subsequently seen is that every species ever measured for any aspect of athletic performance also shows this speed-duration relationship. So it's been seen in horses, in mice, even in crabs, and if you can believe it, lungless salamander as well. And so across the whole biological spectrum this thing applies. And so it seems to be relating to a fundamental aspect of exercise physiology. But of course here we have the world records performed by various different people, and so the curves themselves don't mean much for an individual physiological profile. And so we can do this on individuals, and here's a plot of somebody doing the same kind of thing on a cycloergometer. Now the y-axis is not speed, it's power output, and the x-axis is time. And what we've done here is we've performed 4 bouts of exercise to task failure at different power outputs. So we've performed at 350, 325, 300, and 275 watts. And what we've then done is plotted a hyperbolic function through the data. And this is the same function that A.V. Hill would recognize. And what we've got is the time to task failure, or T-lim, is equal to the W prime divided by the power output of the task, so whatever these are, minus the critical power. Now I've color-coded the parameters W prime and critical power for reasons I'll come on to in a moment, but the critical power is the asymptote of the power-duration relationship. And essentially it says that if you've characterized the severe domain accurately, then the critical power is the lowest point at which the severe domain or behavior in the severe domain would still apply. So it's the point at which the model breaks down or the severe intensity domain stops being relevant. Now the critical power has been assessed to be many different things. It's also been suggested that it's a power output that can be sustained indefinitely, or as Monod and Scherer said in 1965, for a very long time without fatigue. Well, we know that fatigue occurs below and above the critical power, and we know you can't sustain it forever. So it fundamentally is the point at which the severe intensity domain stops applying, and nothing more than that. But of as much interest is this W prime parameter, because it's this parameter that determines how sharply this relationship curves. And how does it do that? Well, W prime is a fixed amount of work that you can do above critical power. Its expenditure, or its rate of expenditure, is determined by the difference between the power you've set in the severe domain and the critical power. So let's, for example, suggest that you've set somebody the task of cycling at 400 watts, and then you make them cycle to exhaustion, or to task failure. What will happen is that they will complete about, or just under 100 seconds of exercise before task failure ensues, and the area of this rectangle is equivalent to the W prime, because if you think about it, you've got power output here in watts, that's joules per second, and you've got time in seconds, so the seconds cancel each other out, so this area here is a measure of joules. And interestingly, if you set them a different challenge, let's say a lower power output, Well, they'll sustain that for longer. In this particular case, just under 5 minutes, just under 300 seconds. But the area of this rectangle is exactly the same as the previous one, because this still represents the W prime. So these two rectangles are essentially the same. And that is what the W prime is. It's a fixed amount of work that can be done above the critical power. Once you've used that up, you reach task failure. Now that's a really interesting model, but the problem with it is you have to do at least 4 trials to task failure to actually characterize it. And it's worse than that, because to know what power outputs to set in the first place, you have to first do a ramp test to determine VO2 max and maximum power output and other parameters. So actually you've done 5 exhaustive exercise tests to get 1 measure of critical power. And imagine then you want to have some kind of intervention. Let's say you're interested in the effect of creatine monohydrate on the power duration relationship. Well, then you've got to do 4 more exhaustive trials following creatine monohydrate supplementation. And if you're randomizing the presentation of those things, you've also got to have a washout period. And so it's going to take many weeks to do that study. What if you want another intervention on top of that? Well, then you're talking about 13 trials to exhaustion. So it gets very quickly unwieldy. And so a challenge we set ourselves some time ago was to try and determine critical power from a single test. And so critical power is an important but very cumbersome parameter. And we set Annie van Hattelo the task of solving this problem for her PhD in 2004. So myself and Joe Dowson and Annie sat down and we wanted to look at alternative ways of characterizing critical power. And they had a number of options like time trials and in the field measurements and things like that. We really couldn't figure out exactly what we wanted to do. But then we also recognized that prolonged all-out exercise testing had been used in the early 1990s, Gaston and Lawson, for example, very notably, to measure anaerobic parameters like the anaerobic power and anaerobic capacity of those tests, and also to measure VO2 max. And when we were in Eastbourne in the early 2000s, myself, Gary Brickley and Jan Derkel worked on this, both to look for VO2 max, but also to see if it could be used to measure critical power. And we used a 90-second all-out test, and we realized that the power output at the end of that test was quite considerably above critical power, so we didn't take that any further. I then went off to Aberystwyth and didn't really think about this for another year. But while we were at Eastbourne, I had my PhD examined by Brian Whipp, and as we showed him the rig that we've been doing this all-out testing on, he said, well, if you exhaust W prime somehow, couldn't you determine critical power using a sprint test? And that was really interesting, but because we went on to study other things, we didn't really take that on any further. And so Joe came up with the idea of perhaps looking at this again, and I said, well, 90 seconds wasn't really long enough, and we knew that, so I don't want to set Annie up for a fall. So Joe said, well, why don't you just extend it? Just have an open-ended test, go all out, and see what happens. And so we looked at this and we looked at Brian's idea, and it was indeed the case. If you look at the power duration relationship and the equation, if W prime's reduced to 0, then the highest attainable power should be the critical power. And so if we could do a test that exhausted W prime in a single test, is that possible to do with all-out exercise? And the way we kind of went about this was much like this XKCD comic. So you pull the lever, you get a zap, it burns you to a crisp, and if you're a normal person you say, I guess I shouldn't do that. If you're a scientist you say, I wonder if that happens every single time. And so rather than pulling on a lever, we were actually doing a 3-minute all-out test, and it does make you feel like this. And the first time we did it open-ended, or rather I did it open-ended because I was the pilot participant. And I managed to last about 2.5 minutes, and then I simply stopped because it was one of the most awful experiences in my life. And I just said, there's no way, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to be able to carry on doing this for an indefinite period of time. I need to know that this thing is going to be ended by an experimenter at some point. And we were a bit down in the mouth about that, and I said, well, Annie, just analyse the data anyway, see what comes out of it, and then we'll try and pivot to other things. And she looked at it, and she then showed me the data, and it looked very much like the power output was approaching critical power, and that looked really promising. And we then thought, well, how much more would be possible? And I said, well, I could probably stretch that to 3 minutes if I had to. If I knew it was going to end, I could probably stretch it to 3 minutes. And that's really why we chose 3 minutes as a duration. And so the question is, what actually happens? Well, here's a picture of me about to do a 3-minute all-out test at a workshop in Exeter in 2007. We've got Jamie Blackwell there preparing the Oxycon Pro mouthpiece ready for the measurement of VO2. So I'm warming up there, but also telling the crowd how the 3-minute all-out test works. In fact, I'm probably saying much the same thing as I said in the previous slides. And then you start the test, and the whole point of this test is it's an all-out test. Every single rev that you produce on the bike should be absolutely a maximal effort, and it shouldn't stop being maximal until the test ends. So here's a picture of me about 2 minutes into the 3-minute test, and you can see from my own expression or lack thereof how stressful that is, but you can also tell from the numbers above. This is respiratory exchange ratio. Anything above 1 means that you're probably producing lactate, so 1.27 is a very high value, so there's a lot of excess CO2 being produced there as a result of bicarbonate buffering of lactate. And this value here, although it's a single breath value, this is minute ventilation. So although it's a single breath value, I regularly produce values above 200 litres per minute when I'm doing this kind of test. So it is a very, very unpleasant 3 minutes, I can promise you. And by the end of it, you are barely able to hold yourself onto the ergometer. But the key thing to do at the end of this test is to warm down. You want somebody on that pedaling at 100 watts or so for at least 10 minutes after the test. Otherwise you will get off and you'll feel absolutely awful, banging headache and all kinds of things. You can also see the values behind me, still VE above 200 litres a minute at the end of the test. But then what does this test actually look like? What does the power profile of a test like this look like? Well, for the first 30 seconds of it, it looks like a Wingate test, a 30-second all-out sprint, because that's essentially what it is. But then something really interesting happens. The power output doesn't carry on dropping. It starts to plateau out. And after about 2.5 minutes, there's clearly a plateau in power output. So we use that as our end test power. The last 30 seconds is averaged, so we get a power value for the end of the test, but it plateaus at a surprisingly high value, in this case of around about 250 watts. Now, to put that in context, that power output is significantly above the end ramp power, but significantly below the gas exchange threshold power. In fact, it's exactly where you'd expect it to be if critical power had been attained. But the other thing we were interested in here was whether or not you could attain VO2 max with a test like this, which is why I was using the mouthpiece in the previous slides. And indeed you can. So this is the VO2 response in the same participant, and you can see VO2 rises very rapidly, and within 60 to 90 seconds attains VO2 peak or VO2 max, and then is maintained for the rest of the test. And this might seem surprising because power output is dropping until that last 30 seconds, so why isn't VO2? Well, that's because until the last 30 seconds of the test, this is being performed in the severe intensity domain. And the thing about the severe intensity domain is it drives VO2 to the maximum. So long as you can sustain exercise long enough to achieve VO2 max, it will get there in the severe domain. So even though power output's dropping, VO2 will carry on rising. So now the next question is, what is this end test power output? How close is it to critical power? And to get that answer, we did another study in which we independently measured critical power using the conventional methods. In this case, I've plotted the work-time relationship. So rather than the hyperbolic non-linear relationship, what you do is you plot work against time, and then you can essentially use linear regression to work out the parameters. So in this case, the slope of the line is critical power, and the intercept of this line is the W prime, and that's because you've got work on this axis, time on the other axis. Work multiplied by time is power, and so that's what you see on that gradient, and then you've got the intercept there for the W prime parameter. So in this case 317 watts and 17.4 kilojoules for critical power and W prime respectively. How did that compare to the 3-minute all-out test in the same participant? Well, the end test power was 316 watts, so a very close relationship to the independently measured critical power. And the work done above the end test power, so essentially that's the area above this curve, was also very similar to the independently measured W prime. So this was really exciting to see these data appear, because prior to this we thought there might be something close to critical power, but we didn't have any idea how close it was going to be. And across the participant sample you can see that all bar 2 participants got within 5 watts of their critical power using a 3-minute all-out cycling test. So this finally convinced us that we were on the right lines, that you could indeed determine critical power using an all-out exercise test by exhausting W prime and therefore measuring critical power. This has also been assessed in isometric contractions, although you need longer to do it. With intermittent contractions you need about 5 minutes, but you get the same relationship between end test torque and critical torque. It's also been shown to estimate critical speed in running, critical speed in swimming, and critical force in hand grip exercise as well. It's also been found that critical power can be determined in rowing ergometry too. So lots going on there, but think about how we do this test and how we do it properly, because great though this test is, there are a number of things you have to get right before the data comes out the way you'd expect it to. And the first thing to note is that familiarization to this test is absolutely crucial. The first time you do a 3-minute all-out test, it feels very, very weird indeed, and so you have to fully brief the participant on what they should expect, how the test is being conducted, what the concept of the test is, and fully brief them on test process. Now you should be doing that already for the purposes of informed consent, but you really have to explain this fully and essentially warn the participant. Even when you do that, it can still come as a shock to some participants, and a story Annie told me was one of the participants she had at Exeter got about halfway through the test and simply pulled out the mouthpiece and shouted, "What the fuck?" And having done this a few times, I can well understand why he felt that. But familiarization is absolutely key. You must also make sure that the effort these people are giving is a truly all-out effort. And there are ways of doing that, but you need to make sure that every single revolution they push onto the pedals is a maximal effort. And for that reason you need to be prepared to repeat tests if you find that the all-out condition has not been met. The reason we can be confident about an all-out test not being all-out is because pacing is very easy to spot, and it's usually seen as an increase in power output towards the end of the test. So power output bottoms out and then it comes back up again. That does not happen if your participants are exercising maximally. The other really important thing to do is to not give time-based feedback, because if you do, pacing is almost inevitable. If you've got a well-trained cyclist and you're giving them regular time checks, they will pace according to that, even if they're doing it subconsciously. So no time feedback whatsoever. What you need to do is shout at your participants a lot, but don't shout encouragement in terms of time-based encouragement. Nearly there. Don't ever say that, because they'll drop their power and then increase it towards the end. Just keep saying every rev maximal, make it all count, and just keep shouting at them in that way. And finally, measure VO2 if you can, or if it's appropriate, because the attainment of VO2 max is one indicator of maximal effort. If they're way off their VO2 max throughout the test, they're nowhere near it and they're not getting anywhere near it, they're probably not producing an all-out effort, and you'll probably also see indications of that in the power output too. If you're not measuring VO2 because you're doing isometric contractions, you can use EMG for the same sort of purpose. What you should expect to find with an all-out test is EMG will decline over the period of the test. If it rises again towards the end of the test, you're probably not seeing an all-out effort in that case. But if you can get all of those things right, we have found in our hands at least, it's a robust and reliable test. And so to summarize, the 3-minute all-out test can measure critical power and its equivalents in a range of different modalities. It's based on the expenditure of that fixed capacity for exercise above critical power, which is represented by the W prime parameter. This allows critical power to be determined from a single short test, although it's not pleasant. The test itself is extremely stressful and must be carefully conducted, both as an experimenter, and the participant must be fully briefed as well in terms of what to expect. So, I present this last slide just to say thank you very much to Annie van Hattelo for being such a superb PhD student. Now, the problem is I didn't have any photos of myself and Annie standing next to one another. I don't know why that is. There may be reasons for that. So what I've had to do is condense a photo that I did have to fit it on the slide. So what I've essentially done is I've cropped Andy Jones and Darrell Wilkerson, but because we all looked the same around that time, this is 2007 in New Orleans, it doesn't really matter. So thanks very much to Annie for all her hard work on this. She's now a full professor at Exeter, so congratulations to her, and thank you all very much for listening to my nonsense. I'll see you next time.